Welcome everyone to our second session of the day for the Disability Organizing Network's 2020 Summit, Leading with Our Strengths. The title of this presentation is called Got Implicit Bias with Rayma McDeed, the Executive Director of Central Iowa Center for Independent Living. And I will now turn the presentation over to Rayma to get right in, and we will follow up with some discussion toward the end. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Russell. This is Rima speaking. Good morning, California. I am honored to join you from Iowa. Yeah, there are Black folks in Iowa. 3.5. I'm the half. Hi, everybody. My name is Rima McCoy McDeed, and I am thrilled to begin a very important conversation, or perhaps for some of you continue a very important conversation with regards to how racial justice, we've been talking about racial justice as a society pretty much nonstop since Memorial Day. How does that fit into the wonderful, wacky world of independent living? Well, we're going to spend the next 2 hours, I was going to say years, because time in 2020 kind of defies all logic and gravity and physics. Anyhow, we're going to spend the next 2 hours together talking about things like implicit bias, as the title alludes to, but other concepts and topics that are specific to racial justice. And we're really going to focus all this stuff on independent living. Because no matter how long you've been involved with independent living, 2 months, 2 years, 20 years, 200 years, you know that this sector is special. It's different, and so it's a space that deserves to have conversations that are as important as this one, geared specific to our environment. And so I really hope that by the time we wrap up this afternoon, it will be afternoon California time by the time we wrap up, but by the time we finish today, you begin to have an understanding of how racial justice interfaces with independent living, and more importantly, have a curiosity with regards to seeking out information on your own that pertains to this subject matter. And so with regard to that, we've got a lot of ground to cover in a very short period of time. Obviously, we're going to discuss what implicit bias is. Implicit bias is one of those terms, it's kind of become a buzzword in 2020. Everybody seems to have their own definition for what it is. And I've noticed that that's causing a lot of unnecessary conflict between people, because if definitions don't align, then that means that conversation misaligns as well. With regard to that, we're also going to discuss what implicit bias is not. And this is a very important piece of the puzzle, because we have spent, as a society, a large amount of time focused on things like overt racism, and we've neglected to see that things like racism exist on a continuum. And that continuum is inclusive of things that we see happening in sills and silks and other IL-specific spaces on a daily basis. They make up the nucleus of what we call systemic racism. And so we'll dive into that as well. And then, very important, we'll explore how and why we hide during conversations about race in independent living. We do a lot of hiding, especially prior to this year. Why? And how does that negatively impact the provision of the 5 core services? We'll talk about that as well. And then, obviously, we will accurately define racism and begin a conversation about, is it important to use the perfect terminology to define what racism is, or is it more important to explore how it manifests in our society? And then finally, we'll wrap up and talk about, does it make sense to continue this conversation in independent living? I'm not going to lie to you. I operate in a variety of spaces as far as IL is concerned. There's a large number of us that feel like this conversation is not only not necessary to independent living, it's divisive and threatens the sustainability of independent living. So we're gonna explore, is that true? And if it's not true, what is true with regards to racial justice in independent living? And so I will begin by articulating what I articulate whenever I begin this conversation with the group. This is a safe space, not necessarily a comfortable space. Safe and comfortable are not always the same thing, especially when we're talking about subject matter that makes people uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable is not a sign that I'm wrong. It could be a sign that you're being pointed in the right direction. Facts always outweigh opinions, and impact always outweighs intent. And so please feel free, put your questions in the chat. I will do my due diligence to stop throughout to catch up with what's going on in the chat. And then I promise we will take a short break kind of midway in between this presentation. So Russell, thank you very much for introducing me. I will go a little more in depth into who I am. Again, my name is Rima McCoy McDeet. My pronouns are she and her. And for those of you listening along, I'll do a brief visual description. I am a 40-year-old light-complected Black American lady with long, natural brown hair. I am wearing half-rimmed glasses. I am seated in a white room with bookshelves behind me. At various odd junctures today, you will see one or more cats. I have 4 of them, or one human child who is my own human child. Anyhow, I'm the executive director of Central Iowa Center for Independent Living. We are located in Des Moines, smack dab in the middle of Iowa. And in addition to providing 5 core services in alignment with how all CILs operate, basically, primarily being staffed by disabled people, we also provide this service, and we call this sort of peer support on a macro level, racial justice training and facilitation and consulting to other CILs and silks throughout the US. We are currently working with several silks and about a dozen CILs at the moment. And so with regard to that, I also work outside of independent living, facilitating trainings on implicit bias and disability, diversity, and intersectionality. I work with the National Association of Social Workers and various other organizations as well. With regards to NICL, I am the co-chair of the Anti-Racism and Equity Task Force, as well as the board treasurer. Last year, I was honored to receive the AT&T Humanity of Connection Award with regards to the work I do pertaining to racial justice. And this year, I received the NICL President's Award, as well as the Region 7 Advocate Award. Also, the first openly autistic individual to run for legislature in US history. I did not win. I could do a whole other presentation on ableism and racism in the political process, but that is a conversation for another time. But we will get started now. So let's just kick things off by defining the word that defines this presentation today. What is implicit bias? So it can be defined as attitudes and or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious manner. So emphasis on the word unconscious. Our brain is on autopilot when we are acting from a place of implicit bias. And to be clear, all of us operate from a place of implicit bias at some point throughout our day, often several times a day. Implicit bias is what informed our ancient ancestors that it was time to run lest they be crushed underfoot by a wildebeest. Fast forward to nearly 2021, there are no longer wildebeests roaming the earth, at least as far as I know. And so implicit bias kind of misfires and causes us to act in ways that can be downright antisocial, particularly with regards to when we encounter people that look different from us. Again, though, implicit bias is what's happening unconsciously. A lot of times we are totally oblivious when we are operating from a place of implicit bias. So Although we all experience implicit bias and it informs our decision-making processes in a variety of ways, today we are focused strictly on implicit bias as it pertains to race. So I want to reiterate that. Everybody experiences implicit bias, so no need to remind me in the chat or anything like that. It's not something that any of us is immune to. However, we are talking about implicit bias as it pertains to race, specifically as it pertains to white people interacting with people who are not white. So, important. Implicit bias is not what we would call overt racism. And so overt racism are acts of racism that almost all of us are on the same page about with regards to being able to label it as, whoa, that's totally racist. Things like burning a cross in front of my front yard. The KKK pulled up and did that. Most everybody in America would say that's deeply offensive, super racist. That's unacceptable. That's an overt act of racism, premeditated, fully conscious. Folks know exactly what they're doing. They know what their goal is, and their goal is to be racist. Calling a Black person the N-word, again, this is an overt act of racism. Racial profiling, overt act of racism. Redlining, this is an overt act of racism that is happening on a systemic level as far as municipal government is concerned. So redlining is specifically creating places in a city that people who are not white are designated to be. And so redlining is really a precursor to what caused things that we, living situations that we would call ghettos or inner cities. And so these are all overt acts of racism. The conversation we must begin, including in IL spaces, is racism just something that happens over there? Is it a boogeyman that's lurking in the shadowy corners and just doing evil deeds all the time? Or is racism actually a continuum? And yeah, that stuff's happening on one end, but there's also stuff happening on the other end and in between. And a lot of this stuff we're not noticing. This is where implicit bias is hanging out, in the covert manifestations of racism. Please understand, ultimately, racism is racism. Okay, there's no, full strength racism or diet racism. It's all racist. But implicit bias, you will find, is operating more so in the covert manifestations of racism. So for those of you who are like, what's she talking about? What's covert racism? What is that? What does implicit bias look like in independent living spaces? So I've got a few examples here. This is not an exhaustive list, but a good place to get us started with regards to thinking about, okay, I see these things happening on a daily basis. What are some other examples? So that's on a resume that has the name Shamika Jenkins at the top. Research shows that hiring managers spend between 7 and 15 seconds perusing a resume or an application when they are looking to fill a position. That's a very small amount of time. And if that's true, that means that objectivity is probably not in the front seat as far as determining who to proceed with and who to pitch into the recycle bin as far as applications are concerned. And so that means that our unconscious, our subconscious is really in the driver's seat. And so implicit bias is very much at play. So hiring managers flipping through those resumes, sees a resume, it says has the name Shamika Jenkins, and without giving it a second thought, places it in the recycle bin and just keeps going. Happens all the time. Research shows that applications or resumes that have names at the top of them that appear to be names of Black people, there's a higher degree of probability that those applications are going to be put into the recycle bin. Implicit bias. Quietly rushing to hide your purse in your desk when a Black male in a delivery uniform walks past, even if his hands are full of packages. So let's unpack this a little bit. Let's say you are clacking away at your laptop, writing an email to a supervisor or whatever, and you don't even look up. You just sense that the Black delivery driver is walking past you, and without giving it a second thought, you grab the purse, toss it into your desk, keep clacking away at your laptop. You're oblivious. You don't ever give it a second thought. You finish the workday, you go home, and that incident never comes to mind for you ever again. The Black man in the delivery uniform was acutely aware of absolutely everything that you did as he walked past. He was very cognizant of you grabbing the purse, putting it in your desk. The reason why he's acutely aware of that is because in many respects, his survival is absolutely contingent on him having a keen understanding of everything that's going on around him at all times and how people are responding to him at all times, because he knows that if he makes anybody feel uncomfortable, it's going to increase the likelihood of them calling the police on him, even if he's not engaged in any kind of remotely criminal activity, which could increase the likelihood of him being shot by police or something along those lines. And so what you see here is truly a cultural disconnect. You've got this incident that's happening. The white person that's putting their purse away is totally oblivious. The Black person is acutely aware. This is a big reason why conversations about racism, particularly in the workplace, experience so much disconnect. Those of us that are brown, Black, other folks of color, we share our experiences of being singled out because of the color of our skin. And invariably, our white colleagues say to us, well, that's not my experience. I've never seen anything like that. I don't know what you're talking about. No, you don't know what we're talking about because you have been conditioned to not notice these things. We, again, out of necessity, are conditioned to absolutely notice all of these things. So, experiencing anxiety when a Black coworker is not smiling. This is another fantastic example of implicit bias. Because of implicit bias, there's this expectation that Black people must appear to be as not threatening as possible in professional environments. And if we are, for whatever reason, not smiling for a moment, or God forbid, having a bad day, that can be very impactful for the white people around us, and the perception of us simply having a bad day, which is something that everybody experiences, is amplified because of fear and concern and misunderstanding and all of that stuff. Determining that hair as it naturally grows out of a person's head is unprofessional. I can't tell you how many policies, procedures, SOPs I go through for SILs or SILKs or other organizations, and there's a section, a dress code section, where there's some kind of articulation about hair. And it almost always singles out people who have natural hair, or kinky hair, or hair that is not Anglo in appearance. So that's something that's rooted in implicit bias. And because of implicit bias, there's this understanding that to look professional is to look one way, and to look unprofessional is to look another way, even if that the way that the person looks is how they naturally look. This is how my hair naturally grows out of my head. And to say that the way my hair naturally grows out of my head is just inherently unprofessional is deeply problematic and very racist. Simplifying your language when speaking with Black people. The implicit bias informs a white person that Black people are not as intelligent as they are. And so there's a growing body of research with regards to observing white people interacting with other white people, and then turning around and interacting with Black people, and downshifting significantly as far as articulation is concerned. And just not even realizing that they're doing it. It happens all the time. And this can happen with consumers of service. This can happen with coworkers or subordinates. It can even happen with supervisors. It happens to me all the time. People assume that because I'm Black, that my proximity to intelligence has been impacted somehow. Now, of course, I'm also on the autism spectrum, so that further compounds my personal experience. But the person does not need to experience a developmental or an intellectual disability in order to have this happen to them. Simply being Black is enough, fortunately. And then finally, assuming that white male, or in the absence of a male, female is a decision maker when walking into a space. Again, this is very much rooted in implicit bias. And so thanks to implicit bias, the default setting for independent living is white, middle class, male, female binary, and apparently disabled. So that very simple statement I've just made, but that probably somewhat provocative to the ears of many of you. And before I continue, I just want to catch us up on the chat for those of us who are listening and not able to see. So we have in the chat, we've got a link to the stream text. So if you're looking for that, just go to the chat. Someone wrote, I do not see settings for a camera, but can see you and will use chat for questions and comments. Perfect. And I don't think that there's anything here that Megan wrote. We are in Zoom webinar mode, so only the presenter and ASL have access to cameras. So please feel free to use the chat. And then Alyssa wrote, chat is not visible to myself. And so I will hopefully Megan or Russell or one of the other coordinators can assist Alyssa with that. Anyhow, so getting back to our presentation. So default setting for independent living, white, middle class, male, female binary, and apparently disabled. That, again, can sound kind of provocative to some folks, but if you think about it, there are hundreds of centers for independent living from coast to coast. Only a handful are led by racially marginalized executive directors. And so, you know, so we've got, so just flagging for Megan and or Russell, we've got several folks that are saying that they can't see the chat. So,
this is Megan. I see that. I'm trying to look into it. Thank you, Raymond.
Perfect. All right. So let's do a little activity together. So I've got on the screen the word, just a simple word, disability.
Raymond, Megan wanted to chime in. I think the issue folks are having, so on Zoom chat, pick the little drop down and select all panelists and attendees. I think right now folks are sending it to all panelists, so attendees aren't able to see messages.
Ah, perfect. So select all panelists and attendees and you will see. Thanks, Megan. All right, so what does hearing or seeing the word disability make you feel? Just think about it, just simple word. This isn't a trick question, just what comes up for you. And got a hashtag up now, hashtag disability so white. How does hearing that hashtag or seeing it on paper, so to speak, make you feel? And these are rhetorical questions, and so just you know, don't feel like you need to share with everybody. But so first screen had the word disability. Second screen, hashtag disability so white. You know, what's the difference in the feelings with regards to those two terms? So if you're feeling any or all even of the following right now: guilt, defensiveness, frustration, irritation, put on the spot, anger, perhaps feeling attacked even, there's a term for that feeling, and that feeling is valid, and the term is white fragility. And so white fragility is another one of those what's become a buzzword here in 2020. So for the purpose of us having a shared understanding of what that word is, I've got a definition. It's defined as discomfort and defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racial inequity and injustice. And so white fragility is, I argue it's a logical response. And I see that as being a counter argument to a lot of the rhetoric that I hear and especially have heard in 2020. White fragility sort of become like a boogeyman that's cowering in the corner along with the word racism. Nobody wants to own it. People just want to put it over there and not entertain the thought that it could be orbiting around them as well. And so, I think that doesn't help as far as driving very important conversation about racial justice. And so I like to offer folks an alternative understanding of what white fragility is. What if it's what you feel when you are being made aware of something that you aren't fully cognizant that you're participating in? It's just simply a manifestation of defensiveness. And all of us, all nearly 8 billion of us on this planet, experience defensiveness when someone brings something to our attention that we weren't aware of, particularly when it pertains to us unwittingly causing harm to other people. And so again, what if white fragility is not like game over kind of thing? What if it is a pretty natural response to being made aware of something you weren't aware that you were participating in? And again, because we have turned the term racism into such a boogeyman that's over there, and we don't want to own it, there's a lot of struggle and cognitive dissonance with regards to entertaining the notion that it could be something that we participate in. It's a big reason why this conversation has been so difficult to entertain in independent living spaces. One of many reasons. We'll get to some of the other reasons here a little bit later today, but this is, Defensiveness 101. Again, we all experience defensiveness. We are talking about defensiveness as a response or a reaction today to being made aware of the fact that we are engaging in behavior that, if it's not directly racist, perpetuates systemic racism in independent living, in our society, etc. And so please keep in mind the nucleus of something like white fragility is implicit bias, and implicit bias is unconscious. Big reason why these conversations are so uncomfortable for so many people is because until very recently, this stuff was happening, and a large number of our population, people who are white, were oblivious, were completely unconscious. And so it's really hard to have meaningful conversations about something that you're not aware of. And one of the steps that occurs before productive conversation can be had by white people about something like racial justice is shifting from denying, from being unconscious to denying that one is participating in the perpetuation of racism, to accepting that, and then being open to actually engaging in productive conversation. Ultimately, there's nothing wrong with you if you experience white fragility, if you experience implicit bias, or if you make decisions based in this stuff. This is your opportunity to know better and then move forward and do better. They're up to the point where you're unaware of all this stuff. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. You have been conditioned to not notice this stuff. But once you've been presented with an opportunity to examine, then the onus of responsibility shifts considerably. And we do need to have conversations about, the choices that you make that are informed by implicit bias, that perpetuate systems that exclude racially marginalized people in independent living spaces, and so on and so forth. And so when you find yourself in a situation where you are experiencing white fragility, you have choices. You can respond or you can react. And we've seen a lot of really extraordinary examples of people reacting to white fragility. Videos of people going viral on social media for calling the police on Black people in parks or in drugstores or that kind of thing. You know, that does not need to be the next step. When somebody experiences white fragility, they don't necessarily need to embarrass themselves or put racially marginalized people in danger. A person can respond. But the question is how do we know how to respond when we are experiencing white fragility? So stopping, taking a breath, and I offer these 3 questions to support people in grounding themselves when they are feeling white fragility. Is this feedback true? Is what Rima's saying right now that feels very deeply triggering to me, is it true? Am I too triggered to tell if it's true? I don't know about you all, but when I'm feeling defensive, objectivity is nowhere to be found. And my decision-making processes are very seriously impacted. I'm too triggered to tell if something is true. So if I know that, I can ask myself, well, how do I know how to respond right now? Should I respond? Or maybe should I just sit with my feelings and check in with myself a little bit later? Give myself time. You know, we don't need to instantaneously respond to everything all the time, especially when we're in a situation that feels very unfamiliar to us. And, you know, this race and equity stuff feels very unfamiliar to a lot of you. That's okay. So I'm going to catch us up with the chat here. All right, let's see. Looks like the communication kinks as far as the chat have sorted themselves out, so that's great. Someone noted, I read the book White Fragility, but it got so much better hearing you present it at the NICO conference. Well, thank you. We don't always have to respond. Great point. Yeah, it's true. We don't always have to respond, at least not immediately. All right, so let's go a little bit deeper. Let's talk about white privilege. So again, this is another one of those buzzwords. What does it mean? For the sake of us having a shared understanding, I've got a definition here for you. So it's defined as inherent advantages possessed by a white person on the basis of their race in a society that's been characterized by racial inequality and injustice. And so, you know, a lot of times when I'm talking about white privilege with white people, they say to me, oh, I can't have white privilege because I'm not a famous person or a powerful politician or a billionaire or that kind of thing. And, you know, white privilege is a little more nuanced than that. You know, just because a person has white privilege doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily be a billionaire or politically powerful person. You know, white privilege sort of seeps into our society in a much more subtle capacity than that. So let's talk about what that looks like in IL specifically. So I'm going to read these as if I'm a white person. Obviously, I'm not a white person, but I'm going to read these as if I'm a white person. The decision makers for my Sil and Silk have the same skin color as me. My Sil and Silk were incorporated by people who have the same skin color as me. The most notable people in IL have the same skin color as me. My Sil and or Silk have a dress code with a section about hair, but it isn't applicable to me because mine is not kinky. People with the same skin color as me decide at my Sil and Silk what difficult conversations will be breached and how they will be breached. This is an important one because Think about your organizations, your SILs, policies, procedures, guidelines with regards to racial harassment, sexual harassment, ableism, that kind of thing. The racial harassment policy in particular, because you've got a situation where, you know, the decision makers by and large for most SILs are white people. And so you have white people deciding whether or not, when a racially marginalized employee approaches them and says, I have experienced racism, you have white people ultimately deciding, oh, that was racist, or no, that wasn't racist. That's deeply problematic, to say the least. People with the same skin color as me have the final say regarding harassment investigations at my SIL and SIL. So this is a rhetorical question. I have sent this PowerPoint to Russell, and Russell is welcome to send it to anybody, or you're welcome to reach out to me and I can get it to you. But I've got several rhetorical questions that are interspersed in this presentation, just things for you to take with you to possibly discuss at your next staff meeting or strategic planning session, whatever. What does white privilege look like at your SIL or SILC? Just take that with you, or just sit and think about it. So, something I hear all the time, especially when I'm entertaining these conversations with independent living folks. I can't have white privilege. I have a disability. Well, let's talk about that. You can still enjoy white privilege in spite of having a disability. Because here's why. Because it's not just white people that have disabilities, right? Disability is a community that anybody can join at any time. Isn't that one of our mantras? You know, people that are Black, brown, other folks of color experience disabilities as well. When we experience disability, we also experience being of color as well. And so it informs when we experience ableism. You know, racism and ableism just sort of compound upon each other. And if we're women, or we're gender nonconforming, or we're members of the queer community, or whatever, all these things compound upon each other. And so if you are white, you don't experience racism in tandem with the ableism. That in and of itself is what white privilege looks like. Now, it's not as glamorous as you know, being a trust fund heiress or something like that, but it is white privilege. And actually, when people say things like, I can't have white privilege because I have a disability, that's implicit bias that's informing that statement, because they're implying that disability is a white experience, that people who are of color don't experience disability as well. And so you can experience white privilege if you have a disability. If you experience whiteness, you experience white privilege, period. So let's talk about how implicit bias becomes weaponized in independent living, because it's deeper than people hiding their purses or passing on resumes that have names that look unfamiliar to us, or that kind of thing. You know, on a macro level, implicit bias can be very harmful for the movement that we are also passionate about. And so let's talk about that. I call this the SU incident. So 18 months ago, almost 18 months ago, so July of 2019, Bruce Darling, who at the time was the Nickel board president, along with adapters, paid Congresswoman Anita Eshoo's office on Capitol Hill a visit to do some systems advocacy regarding Disability Integration Act, which is great. We've all done probably lots of fantastic systems advocacy regarding Disability Integration Act. Now, during this very brief visit, Bruce Darling conflated the US disability community with immigrants that are detained in camps at the US-Mexico border. So What does that mean exactly? So here's a quotation from Darling himself. Democrats care more about people who are not legally in this country than their own citizens who are disabled. We are more concerned about immigrants who happen to come here in non-legal manner than we are with our own citizens. So this is just full of implicit bias, and it's also full of overt racism as well, but we're focused on the implicit bias stuff here. So specifically, let's pick this statement apart and identify the implicit bias of it. One, there are no immigrants in the US disability community. According to that statement, that made it sound like there are no immigrants in the US disability community, which obviously is not true. Those of you out in California, you have your disability community has a significant number of immigrants in it. Second piece that's informed by implicit bias. There are no disabled people at the border camps, the detainment camps, the concentration camps, whatever you want to call them. They are devoid of disabled people. That was a implicit bias of the statement. This is, of course, is not true. Not only are there people who are disabled who are at these detention camps, leading into the third piece of implicit bias in the statement. The conditions of the camps themselves will and are causing and exacerbating disabilities. There's a lot of talk, not as much as there should be. There's a fair amount of talk regarding people incurring things like post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of living in these detainment camps. We've got scores of children living in these camps who are being very impacted as far as their mental health is concerned, and will grow into being a generation of traumatized people that are part of our community, the disability community. And the reason why they are joining our community is because they have been traumatized in these camps. And so this was all kind of forgotten when that statement, when this systems advocacy was attempted last July. The biggie, as far as implicit bias is concerned, free our people, in quotes, is not inclusive of immigrants. Immigrants are not our people, ultimately. That's what that simple statement from Darling said to the folks that were able to be in attendance during that bit of systems advocacy. And so, this visit laced with implicit bias, obvious xenophobia, racism, all that stuff, deeply offensive. And some would argue that, as a result of this brief visit, the trajectory, the future of the Disability Integration Act was permanently altered as a result of this visit. Whether you feel that that's the case or not, most everybody can argue that advocacy around the Disability Integration Act certainly shifted significantly after this brief visit. And so this is an example of implicit bias harming the entire movement, unfortunately. Now, for those of you who are thinking, okay, that was an isolated incident, let's not beat a dead horse or, whatever, or you can think of exceptions to everything that I've brought up. I'm sure you can. And, a big reason why these types of conversations have been so difficult to facilitate in IL is because we focused on exceptions, and because there is an exception to this, we're just not going to talk about that. The thing is, though, 2020 is all about systems. We're talking about systemic barriers to inclusion. We're talking about systemic racism. And so we can't hide from this conversation by focusing on the exceptional. We are talking about the rules. We're focused on the rules because the rules very much tie into the systemic. And it's the systemic, the subtle, kind of the undercurrent stuff that, again, until very recently, a lot of you, if you are white, did not notice that this is all coming to the surface now. And it's deeply uncomfortable. And to a certain extent, if you really truly wanted to, you could squash this conversation as far as your whatever your immediate network is. But the thing is that, you know, you can't unring a bell, so to speak. You know, the bell has been rung, and this conversation's happening, and more people are realizing that in order for our movement to sustain itself and thrive and evolve, we have to have this conversation. We have to address the systemic barriers to the inclusion of racially marginalized people in our spaces. And in order for us to do that, we can't focus on the exceptions anymore. We have to focus on the rules. So this is another one of those rhetorical questions. After Memorial Day, a large number of SILs and silks across the country issued solidarity statements. And if your SIL or silk wrote one, you know, what does it look like? Why did it get written? Why now? Why not before Memorial Day? Something to take with you to think about. So let's kind of shift the light from independent living and just shift it back to general society here for a second. For those of you who are feeling like we're getting a little too hyper focused on IL, let's focus on just society in general for a moment. So, systems of oppression are not medieval torture devices. They're the framework that we live in. They're the framework that we work in as well. This is, you know, the systems of oppression, also known as systemic barriers to inclusion, because the things that cause barriers to inclusion are also the same things that cause oppression. You know, being excluded is being oppressed. So they inform implicit bias, and they're the framework that we work and live in. We'll talk more about that here in a few minutes, but before we do that, let's do a quick exercise. And again, this is just something to think about. You don't need to articulate it or put anything in the chat or anything like that, unless you're absolutely dying. What do you think of when you hear or see the word man? So just man, M as in Mary, A, N as in Nancy. What comes to mind for you when you hear or see the word man? So for those of you listening along, I've got a picture of one of the first images that pops up for me when I Google man. This is a middle-aged white person, white male, white man. He's in a suit. He's got a blue silk tie on, button-down shirt. His hair is very well groomed. He's got a beard that's closely cropped. He's giving a thumbs up and he's smiling. He looks like a very affable, perhaps middle management, vice president kind of guy. You know, he looks like he could work at a bank perhaps and you know, turn me down for a loan, personal loan with a smile. So this is what comes up for me. Now I say this knowing that what my Google search results look like could be very different from yours. But again, this is just a brief exercise. So moving forward, what do you think of when you hear or see the words black man? So black man, very simple. And for those of you listening along, I've got a screenshot of what comes up when I do a Google image search for black man. And it's the first two rows of my Google image search results. The very first image is of George Floyd, who I'm sure you know was murdered by Minneapolis police on Memorial Day of this year. After George Floyd, we have Mr. Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed by 3 white men who are closely linked to law enforcement in Georgia earlier this year. We also have a gentleman who apparently was racially profiled at customs. He was flagged because of the size of his lips, another black man. At the bottom left, we have a gentleman who sued his employer for racial discrimination, okay, which resulted in a settlement. A check was cut to him because of the settlement. He took the check to a bank and attempted to cash the check. The bank called the police on him because they did not feel that a person like him would have a check like that. So think about that, folks. Racial discrimination lawsuit results in a settlement and a check is issued. The Black man takes the check to the bank and experiences racial discrimination in his attempt to cash the check. Only in America, folks. Just really outrageous. He has since sued the bank. I'm not sure what the outcome is, but just wow, really. And then the last image that you can see is of a Black gentleman in Alabama who was executed. So just compare and contrast. When I Google man, I didn't even Google white man or businessman or anything. I simply Googled man. Contrast that with what comes up when I Google Black man. You know, affability contrasted with trauma, basically. So we're Googling implicit bias here. And for those of you who like to do research, there's a growing body of research with regards to how internet search engines interface with implicit bias and inform implicit bias. It's fascinating stuff. I encourage you to seek out information regarding that subject matter if that's of interest to you. But this is, you know, implicit bias is just so pervasive in our society that it's, if you have questions about what it is, you can simply Google it and find lots of fascinating information. And in the act of seeking the information, you can encounter fantastic examples of what implicit bias looks like, just by simply engaging in the act of Googling. So your white privilege and your implicit biases are conditioning that are inherent to the system that we live in. And your white privilege and your implicit biases are coupled with an obliviousness with regards to how they work in society, how they benefit you, and how they subjugate people who are not white. So for instance, how many Black SIL directors are there? You know, how many total SIL directors are there? And then how many Black ones are there? How many Black SILK directors are there? How many Black people are in decision-making, like real, tangible decision-making roles at national disability organizations? I'm not talking about diversity and inclusion officer type roles. I mean, real deal. Like executive director, CEO, president, whatever. How many of them are Black? How many of them are of color? You know, who at your SIL or SILK that's operating in a decision-making role, again, not like a diversity and inclusion type role, but who at your SIL or SILK is Black, Indigenous, or another person of color that works in a decision-making role? These are rhetorical questions, just to get folks thinking. Let me catch us up with the chat. Oh, I see Christina Mills is here. Hey, girl. Let's see, someone. What about the privilege of other people of color? You know, it's a great question. We're here together for 2 hours. And so the focus of conversation today is the privilege of white people. And so, but I encourage you, if that's something that you want to investigate, to seek that information out. Do ILCs count as SIL? Yeah, independent living centers, centers for independent living. I know depending on where you are in the US, your acronym could be ILC or CIL. So, and then Carl wrote, it's just another acronym for the same thing. Thank you. All right. So let me do a time check. All right, so folks, it's 10:55 your time. I promised us a break. This is a good point for us to take a 5-minute break. Just get a chance to step away from your screen. And so we'll come back at 11 o'clock your time. So 10:55 now. Let's plan to be back at 11 o'clock, folks. Thank you. Hello, everybody. This is Rima. It is 11 o'clock your time. It'll give us a few moments to get ourselves reacquainted with our computer screens. And just so you know, I will stop my monologue about 15 minutes prior to the end of this presentation to allow for folks to ask any questions that you might have, questions that you might feel are too substantial for the chat, or if you just want to verbally articulate them. You can also throw, if you have questions that you want me to catch away from the chat, you can use the Q&A function as well. I forgot to mention that. So. And Christina put a great point in the chat. How did I not know about the Google implicit bias? I just typed woman and got a bunch of diverse women. I put in disabled woman and got a bunch of women in wheelchairs. What the heck? Yeah, absolutely. You know, Google can inform implicit bias of a variety of manifestations. So it's, again, really fascinating. If you're I don't know, well, I think California's been a lot more progressive than Iowa has been as far as handling of the pandemic, but we are finally hunkering down into what possibly could be our first shutdown. We never actually shut down earlier this year, but things are getting very dire here. And so folks are spending a lot of time inside. If you are a person that is spending a lot of time inside and looking to entertain yourself and you're sick of Netflix or whatever, again, this is a fascinating thing to look into and to do some research on. All right. So let's talk about the roots of the disability rights movement of independent living. Were Black people taken into consideration as independent living came into being? These are rhetorical questions. Remind me who inspired the independent living movement, the disability rights movement. You know, again, if you Google or if you just know, it's generally understood that the Black civil rights movement informed and inspired the disability rights movement. You know, Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision of 1954, the Civil Rights Act of 64. You know, both of these federal level mechanisms were very inspirational to the folks, the fine, wonderful folks that begat the disability rights movement / independent living movement. And both of these ultimately informed subsequent legislation and Supreme Court decisions that pertain to disabled people. And so that the roots are there. You know, the Black people engaged in civil rights efforts for our community inspired ultimately the disability rights movement. But the ironic piece is that after the disability rights movement set its foundation and created itself, it began to systematically exclude and erase the people that inspired the movement itself, Black people. And that means articulating that can be very upsetting to some people, and I get that. It's a hard thing to hear. I especially since Crip Camp was released earlier this year, I've had a bunch of people say to me, well, the Black Panthers were there. They were supports to the disability community. They fed disabled activists who were engaged in the disability rights movement. Yes, absolutely. But they were there as a support in a subordinate position. leadership. There certainly were people who were Black and brown and other folks of color who attained some modicum of leadership capacity in disability rights movement. But a lot of times those folks have been erased. And it's only been recently that their names have come back into conversation as far as the disability rights movement. Why were they erased? Why did their historical contributions to our movement fall by the wayside? What's up with that? Why has it been so difficult for racially marginalized people, Black people in particular, to assume leadership roles in disability spaces? If it was Black people ourselves who inspired the disability rights movement in the first place. There's a lot of irony there. There's a lot of opportunity to sit and grapple with that, if you will. And in the midst of that, or perhaps right now, you might be feeling a little bit of overload, which is completely normal. Our brains are very much like computer programs. The systems that we work and live in are very much like computer matrices. If you're of my generation, young Gen Xer, probably the movie The Matrix was very influential too during your college years. And that movie, and the trilogy is all about the matrices that we live in, and of course it goes into philosophical realms that I'm not going to touch right now, but we work, we live, and our brains operate in these matrices, and they've been designed to run with specific rules and language and coding, if you will, and malfunction when they're presented with code that veers from that original programming. A big part of being a human being is being conditioned, and a big part of this conversation is about deconditioning folks, deprogramming, if you will, and allowing for opportunity for space for the rest of us to kind of make our way into all of this stuff. And so if you're experiencing white fragility at the moment, whether or not you're willing to admit it, it's really ultimately a very human way of your brain saying does not compute. I deal with people who are actively experiencing white fragility on a daily basis, and sometimes on an hourly basis. People who throw a lot of anger at me, who feel like I'm the problem for simply bringing this stuff up. And what I hear, no matter what it is that's coming out of their mouth or what their body language is saying or anything like that, they're basically like a computer that's saying, you are spitting code at me that is not computing, ultimately. And it's causing my system to overload. But the thing is, as we all know, computers have evolved. And so can we. So can IL. 50 years ago, the technology that is present in my smartphone, and for those of you listening along, I'm holding up my smartphone for folks to see, and it's a pretty outdated smartphone, but it's still tiny. And the technology that drives it probably would have filled a building, or at least a very large room 50 years ago. But because computer technology has evolved, it now literally fits in the palm of my hand. Our movement can evolve the same way. We can evolve the same way. Entertaining these conversations is a crucial part of bringing forth that evolution, however. So that was a lot in a very short period of time. So inhale, and let's talk about, this is my favorite angle to tackle racial justice in independent living spaces. We're going to talk about disability rights, probably in a way that many of you are not accustomed to talking about disability rights. We're going to talk about, are they a mechanism that ultimately, ironically enough, is keeping us from being able to identify systemic gaps in independent living? Super provocative stuff, right? All right. So before we dive into that, let's just catch us all up. Now, obviously, it's the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We probably all know the Americans with Disabilities Act, but you know, the thing is that it's a pivotal piece of legislation that has positively impacted the disability community. Nobody can deny that. In fact, it's positively impacted society as a whole. You know, anybody that appreciates having access to an elevator in a public space should thank the Americans with Disabilities Act, because prior to July 26, 1990, access to elevators and ramps and escalators in public places was, you know, extremely hit or miss. So, fantastic piece of legislation. The Olmstead decision, you know, the recent passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg brought the Olmstead decision into mainstream conversation, albeit briefly, earlier this fall. But this is another piece of federal level, another federal level mechanism that has positively impacted the disability community. And, you know, I have the word unjustified in quotation marks here. For those of you that are listening, I have written, the unjustified segregation of disabled people constitutes discrimination according to Section 2 of the ADA. Because of course, the intellectually disabled and developmentally disabled communities, you know, tend to be a marginalized disability community within the disability community. And, you know, to a certain extent, it's taken for granted that if a person experiences an intellectual or developmental disability, it's completely justified to put them away in a institutionalized setting. Nobody gives it a second thought, including lots of folks that are members of the disability community. So that, of course, is a conversation for another time. The marginalization of intellectually and developmentally disabled people within the disability community. But I do like to throw that out here. And then, of course, the Disability Integration Act, which is all about shifting resources from institutional settings into community-based settings via Medicaid, via HCBS funding. So wonderful stuff, right? Let's talk about disability justice for a second. So for the purpose of us having a shared understanding of what justice is, I have a definition. So it's about the use of power, sometimes as it's appointed by law, but more often by honor or standards to support fair treatment and due reward. Keep in mind, there was a time in our country when it was against the law to help people that were enslaved to emancipate themselves. And so, you know, justice was about overlooking what the law was at the time and focusing on honor and standards to support fair treatment and due reward. How does that play out with regards to the disability community? So let's talk about the hubris of rights. This is where we get kind of provocative for a second. So the thing is that rights often have insufficient mechanisms for actual enforcement and or accountability. We all know that. You know, we can groan on and on and on about unfunded mandates that exist in the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, et cetera, et cetera. We know that. And so it's a bona fide shortcoming of rights. And then obviously, lots of us experience the David and Goliath-like dynamics between advocates and lobbyists in the eyes of legislators. You know, we do our little systems advocacy, we do what we can, but we don't have access to millions of dollars like lobbyists do. And if that's a mechanism that ultimately impacts access to rights, then it's a shortcoming. And then here's where we get super provocative. Rights typically only benefit the most privileged members of a marginalized community that they're meant to protect. How does that play out in independent living spaces? before we get to that, let's talk about what are some of the barriers to racially marginalized people who are disabled benefiting from, like, the Americans with Disabilities Act, for instance. For those of you that are like, what? How does that work? Well, think about it this way. If I am an Indigenous disabled person and my first language is a language that's indigenous to the country that we know of as the United States of America, Navajo, for instance, and I am seeking accommodation with regards to my speaking Navajo, which is, again, indigenous to the United States, more indigenous certainly than English is, I'm out of luck as far as the Americans with Disabilities Act is concerned, because the Americans with Disabilities Act only offers protections in English and American Sign Language. And so that's one of actually many examples of barriers to racially marginalized disabled people benefiting from something like the Americans with Disabilities Act. Again, this is another great research project for those of you who have never perhaps thought about the fact that something like the Americans with Disabilities Act ultimately is not intersectional. Speaking of that, rights in and of themselves are about creating parallels rather than intersections. Let me explain. Ultimately, rights are all about creating space for populations of people in a society that wasn't built for them in the first place. The folks that founded the United States of America, when they put quill to paper and wrote, "We the people," we're not thinking of you if you are disabled, for sure. They were not thinking of me with regards to being Black outside of the capacity of providing services to the people. We're not thinking of Indigenous folks outside of the context of being eradicated for the benefit of the people, so to speak. And so conversations about rights have come into being to afford those of us who are not taken into consideration when the founders said all men are created equal, and are all about kind of creating little places for us to squeeze ourselves in the mainstream society. People who have the privilege, white privilege, to decide whether to extend or withhold these rights from people who have little to no power, who ask for them. Think of that dynamic. We're disabled folks. We're going to Congress to ask people who are not disabled to please make some room for us. I don't know if we think about rights in that context enough, but that is the dynamic. And that dynamic is actually very problematic when you sit and think about it. If and when the powers that be say, "Oh, sure, we will give you some rights," it's typically the most privileged of our community that benefit. And then they use those benefits to assume the roles of powers that be. And now we've got Centers for Independent Living, or ILCs, all over the country, and they're by and large run by white people. We have created a parallel society that mirrors the mainstream society. But the oppressors, and I don't mean that in a intentional way. None of us is waking up and saying, how can I oppress an entire population of people? But systemically, we play out the roles that we have been given. And so the oppression, the systemic oppression that you see happening in mainstream society duplicates itself in IL. And just like in mainstream society, by and large, it's white people who run everything and benefit the most from things being run the way that they are. That happens in IL. That might sound very hurtful to many of you, but if you are feeling triggered right now, again, ask yourself those three questions. Is what Rima's saying true? How do I know it's true? And how do I know how to respond? And then ultimately, the powers that be, white supremacy evolves and prevails. And so again, the disability rights movement was inspired by the Black civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. And once the infrastructure was solidified, Black, Indigenous, Brown, other folks of color were systematically shut out of leadership roles within the movement, unless we were determined to be quote unquote safe people of color who are going to maintain the status quo and, God forbid, not engage in activities that could open the floodgates as far as shifting things to the point of where we're being inclusive to everybody and not just a few tokenizing brown and Black folks every once in a while. And so I want to walk us through this next section, because we are a movement that really prides ourselves on wanting to inform what disability rights look like internationally, right? I mean, we spend a lot of time building relationships with our colleagues in Japan and Germany and other countries, and so as we are building those relationships, we also need to be mindful of the fact of the dynamics at play in other countries as well, and also aware of the fact that we are not an intersectional and fully inclusive movement, and so that could impact, how we approach bringing our movement, into other countries. And so, with regards to that, let's talk about things from a more international vantage point here for a few seconds. Every country has a default setting for quote unquote people with disabilities. It's typically the racial or ethnic majority for that respective country, typically folks that are male, female binary, so present as male, present as female, do not present as anything else. Whatever the predominant religious affiliation is for the country is also the default setting for those people with disabilities, and then apparently disabled. The more removed a person is from the default setting, the more likely they are to end up incarcerated. And this is no matter where you are on planet Earth. The more removed you are from the default setting for your respective country, the more likely you are to end up incarcerated, homeless, institutionalized, relegated to subservient employment, ostracized from family and community, and or otherwise occupying the fringes of mainstream society. This is an especially important slide for those of you who scratch your head wondering why more racially diverse people are not making their way to your independent living centers. Is it that they are so removed from mainstream society, so on the fringes that you're unable to navigate yourself to where they are? Again, this is a rhetorical question, but it's something to think about if you have intentions to diversify your consumer base for your independent living center. Worldwide, multiply marginalized disabled people die earlier than those who are singularly marginalized by disability and by, of course, non-disabled people as well. This is an important topic of conversation as we are in the grips of a worldwide pandemic, obviously. Sometimes those premature deaths, are they intentional? Are they unintentional? Here's a quote from the United Nations. Mortality for children with disabilities may be as high as 80% in countries where the under 5 mortality rate as a whole has decreased to below 20%, says the United Kingdom's Department for International Development, adding that in some cases it seems as if children are being weeded out. This isn't just an international thing. This is a US thing as well. I mentioned the pandemic. As many of us know, especially those of us who do a lot of systems advocacy, several states throughout the country have tried it, are currently trying it as far as medical rationing is concerned, and trying to rationalize the withholding of medical care for certain populations of people in the interest of being pragmatic. It's deeply offensive stuff, very deeply impacts the disability community. So if you want IL to be an international movement that's not fraught with hubris, then you've got to start using your privilege to confront the system here. We can't hyper focus on the plight of disabled people in the Philippines or Botswana or wherever without also being mindful of the plight of disabled people right here in the US, particularly disabled people that, if you're white, are a different color from you and might as well live in a different planet or on the moon for many folks. So acknowledging what your privileges are. There are more privileges than white privilege, but white privilege certainly is kind of the pinnacle of privileges. Critically assessing how your society benefits you and subjugates others because they lack the privileges that you possess. Commit to saying the quiet things out loud on behalf of those that are muted as a result of their marginalization, but don't go and do what non-disabled advocates do to us, speaking over us, holding on to the mic, gripping it for all that it's worth. The goal obviously is not to speak for others long-term, but to work towards creating a paradigm that allows all of us to speak for ourselves. And then pass the microphone ultimately. So I'm going to walk us through this and then I'll catch us up as far as what's going on in the chat. And before I articulate any of this stuff, which will upset many of you, I want to preface it with, I am a colleague of yours. I've worked at CISL for 6 years now. I have a master's degree in nonprofit business administration. My career has been in human services primarily. All that aside, I am also fully cognizant of the following: social services, nonprofits, non-governmental organizations, and other similar type entities, including CILs, independent living centers, whatever you want to call them, exist because of white colonizer supremacy. Let me explain. They are if you're familiar with the yin-yang symbol, they are the yin to capitalism's yang, and they feed off of each other, and they use multiply marginalized, racially marginalized people in particular for fodder. The vast majority of folks that are quote unquote frontline workers are folks that are multiply marginalized, are folks that are racially marginalized and also a member of the disability community or the queer community or all of the above. They are very removed from the default setting for our society as a whole. And the nonprofit sector rose up in response to the fact that capitalism, systems that drive capitalism, create marginalization to the point of where we've got people that are housing insecure, are food insecure, and marginalized and demoralized in a variety of other capacities. And so nonprofit organizations came into being to fill that need. And so keeping that in mind, we have to see that our passion should not be about building a career for ourselves in social justice or whatever necessarily. We should be really more focused on working ourselves out of jobs, asking ourselves constantly, what would a society that's so just and verdant that it no longer needs independent living centers because people are so fully integrated into society as a whole? What would that look like? What can I do to support society to become that? That's what we should be thinking about more so than, what's the next step as far as my career is concerned. I'm not saying it's wrong to not think about the trajectory of your vocation, but ultimately we need to be guided by something that's larger than us. At no time in human history has a group with power willingly handed it over to folks who don't have it, simply because the folks who don't have it ask for it nicely. Let me unpack that a little bit. When I went to my first Nickel conference in 2016, I was struck because people got on stage who were bragging about having gotten arrested. And I had no understanding of bragging about getting arrested, because my personal experience with law enforcement officer has informed me to avoid law enforcement at all costs. When I was 5, I saw my father get violently arrested by police. When I was 7, my uncle, who's Black man, was killed by police in Detroit. I am deeply triggered whenever I see police anywhere in any capacity. I have no frame of reference for being exhilarated or delighted at the prospect of getting arrested. So all these people on stage were white people. You know, they obviously did not have the frame of reference that I had. But what struck me was that the audience cheered when these folks were bragging about getting arrested. And I was truly taken aback, because I had done and continue, obviously, to do a lot of advocacy work with regards to Black folks. And I have never heard anybody cheer on Black folks who speak about engaging in advocacy in a manner that's so assertive that it renders a person vulnerable to getting arrested. And as I became more and more involved in the independent living movement, what struck me is that the same people that would figuratively or literally give a standing ovation to disability activists who are bragging about getting arrested, those same folks demand that racially marginalized folks who are engaged in our own systems advocacy within independent living spaces would turn around and say, "You're not being respectful enough," or "You're not being nice enough. You need to be respectful. You need to do this in a way that doesn't upset me." And so there's a double standard there. When we're engaged in disability activism, we can be in your face, piss on, pity, get arrested, all that stuff, and have palm fronds thrown at our feet when we go to the Nickel Conference. But when we turn around and do activism with regards to being racially marginalized with that same verve and fervor, those same folks will turn around and ostracize us or do what they can to get us removed from the IL spaces by any means necessary. It's a point of hypocrisy, and I bring it up for you to think about. Think very seriously about that. Is that a place where you want to be, where you are applauding one group that engages in activism and deriding another group for engaging in same level of activism for their group? Keeping in mind, nobody asking nicely for some rights has not resulted in the procurement of the rights. Rights are almost always taken as opposed to given. And so if you're truly committed to structural change for disabled folks, that means you need to be truly committed to structural change for Black and brown disabled folks as well, which is going to cause an upsetting of the status quo, not just for society, but for independent living as well. And so ultimately, with regards to rights versus justice, again, rights are rooted in status quo, and we'll talk about status quo here in a moment. They mostly help the most privileged of a marginalized group. So the rest of us are just kind of hung out to dry, basically. Justice is all about upsetting the status quo and making room for everybody. That's all I want. I want for there to be room for everybody. Power, again, not voluntarily given away. I can't hold up my bowl to the powers that be and say, "Please, may I have some rights?" Taken by force. There's no historical precedent for asking for rights nicely and having them extended. And so if you've ever found yourself in a situation where you have finger wagged a brown or Black person and said, "You're not asking nicely enough, so I'm not going to listen to you," you need to also understand that asking nicely has never proven to be an effective way of incurring rights. Never has worked. Never has worked. And so if we're demanding that racially marginalized people ask nicely or be respectful, when we are advocating for ourselves, either in society at large or within independent living spaces, we are asking for racially marginalized folks to engage in a way that's not going to yield positive results for them. But it's going to make sure that we stay comfortable. The only way to shift that dynamic and create space for racially marginalized people to be stakeholders in IL, to assume leadership, bona fide, real deal leadership, not diversity and inclusion officer positions, but real stuff, is by people who have privilege, people who are white, intentionally using their power to shift the paradigm. That's another thing that has no historical precedent. It doesn't mean that it can't happen, but if it's probable, if it's going to happen, it's really up to people that are white saying, yeah, I'm willing to do this. I'm willing to do what has never happened in history in the interest of shifting this movement and making sure that it's truly inclusive to everybody, because I'm fully cognizant of the fact that the disability community is the only marginalized community that anybody can be a member of. Not everybody can be queer. Not everybody can be fabulous like me and be queer. Not everybody can be a woman. You know, not everybody can be a religious minority, but everybody potentially could be a disabled person. And so really, we should all feel the onus, the imperative to do what we can to make sure that this movement is open and available to everybody. Otherwise, we need to stop bragging about the fact that anybody can become a part of our community at any time. That's really a messed up thing to brag about if we're just going to turn around and not be inclusive to everybody. So, for those of you listening along, I've got a picture of a tumbleweed on a deserted highway here, along with the statement, Black Lives Matter Statements of Solidarity, issued by Sills and Silks from 2013 through Memorial Day, or day before Memorial Day of this year. I don't really know of any, but Memorial Day happened, and it seems like every Sill and Silk from sea to shining sea issued some kind of statement of solidarity. What happened? What shifted? Why? You know, how did we go from, oh, we're not going to touch that, to everybody is issuing a statement of solidarity? Rhetorical question, you know, what does your Sill or Silk's statement of solidarity look like, systemically speaking? This is a question for you to take back to your respective Sills or Silks staff meeting or whatever. You know, it's been several months since if your Sill or Silk issued one, several months since it was issued. It's probably gathering a little bit of dust, so dust it off and have a look at it. What does it say? So I want to catch us up in the chat here for a second. There we go.
And Rayma, this is Russell, and I also want to point out that we have a couple of questions in the Q&A also. So a couple of them have been submitted that way.
I'm gonna catch us up on the chat, and then I'll hop over to Q&A. Let's see, Christina wrote, one of our ILC founding directors in the Bay Area was Black. We also had some non-white founders in SoCal. That's wonderful, you know. I don't know if this statistic is correct. And I'm not sure if there's an easy way to find a correct statistic, but my understanding is that of all the centers for independent living in the country, you know, less than 15 are led by Black people. So there's hundreds of centers for independent living in the country. And so that's a very stark minority. And then, you know, the percentage is pretty similar as far as Latinx directors. And then the percentage becomes even more dire when you talk about Asian American directors. And so I know that California is certainly one of the most diverse states in the country. And so it makes sense that your independent living community would be more diverse than what we possibly see in other parts of the US, particularly in the inland states. Let's see. We had some folks that were having some technical issues. Someone asked if they will be able to get a copy of the presentation. Again, Russell has it. You're welcome to reach out to Russell. You can also reach out to me. I'm happy to send it on as well. Let's see. All right. So, and then there were some other questions about being able to hear. So I'm going to hop over to the questions. So my first one is says, my ED doesn't believe in racism and is tearing us apart. What can I legally do? Oh, good Lord. That's a big question. And it's, unfortunately, it's a real issue. I'm going to stop the screen share here for a second. So those of you can see me. Yeah, lots of people who are in decision-making roles don't believe in racism. It's sort of like, not believing in climate change. It's a emotionally charged topic of conversation. And yet, science and research overwhelmingly points to the existence of both climate change and racism. Now, mind you, with regards to the tearing us apart portion of the question, I have a lot of questions with regards to what does that look like? Because the thing is that, with regards to what protections look like, as far as Department of Labor rules and regulations or standard operating procedures for your ILC or your silk, they're very focused on overt. It's not okay to call coworkers the N-word. It's not okay to, sexually assault coworkers. It's not okay to make jokes about people who use, devices to assist them in walking. These are very overt examples of bigotry. With regards to the covert stuff, Department of Labor rules and regulations, state level rules and regulations, and standard operating procedures most definitely fall short with regards to, identifying what that stuff looks like, or prescribing courses of action, or offering protections to people that are being impacted. So if someone were to call me the N-word at work, more than likely, well, I can tell you as far as our SOPs, that would be attended to pretty swiftly. And if it weren't, I could file a complaint with my local or my state level Human Rights Commission with regards to being a member of a protected class and experiencing discrimination and harassment. If someone touches my hair or asks me how I got my hair to do that, whatever that means, and that's not a question that they ask their white coworkers, I'm being singled out. That's what's known as a microaggression. It feels gross to me. It feels racist, but it's a covert example of racism. It's not something that policies, procedures, or Department of Labor rules or regulations addresses even. And so if I go to my HR manager or my immediate supervisor and I tell them, hey, this has happened to me, more than likely they're going to say, well, my hands are tied because our policies and procedures don't address this. And so where does that leave me as a racially marginalized employee of a SIL or a silk? It leaves me in a very frustrating place. And so, unfortunately, we don't have the time to get into it, but my part 2 is all about that issue and how constantly dealing with things like microaggressions causes racial trauma. and increases the likelihood that I'm going to end my tenure at my place of employment because I just don't want to deal with that stuff. The person followed up, the only thing that's overt is the denial of racism in the presence of non-white people. And again, that is offensive, but Department of Labor rules and regulations really offer no guidance with regards to people offering their opinions, no matter how offensive they are, unless they cross a line and the opinion articulates something that is a racial slur. And so if you're listening to me and you're thinking, well, my goodness, this is just a hopeless situation. No, it's not a hopeless situation. The remedy is this: for us as a community, for independent living, to commit to creating a culture that is inhospitable to microaggressions, to covert manifestations of racism. A culture that holds each other accountable to be inclusive and to ensure that these kinds of things that are deeply traumatizing and cause a lot of discomfort for racially marginalized people are not tolerated. And so, independent living is a movement that prides itself on having created a culture for itself. This is next wave stuff. This is really the opportunity to evolve our culture and create spaces that are truly inclusive. Being mindful of the fact that the feds via the Department of Labor is not going to do this for us. We have to do it. We have to ensure that we are creating spaces that are so safe for racially marginalized people that they are inhospitable for folks that are committed to being bigoted. And that bigotry can manifest overtly, it can manifest covertly. And so for those of you who are listening, particularly if you're in a decision-making capacity, particularly if you're someone that says, I've been in independent living for 2 generations or whatever, this should be very exciting to you. This is uncharted territory. This is the next step. We have to take this step if we are going to create communities that are inclusive, to the point of where somebody who doesn't, quote unquote, believe that racism is real, that belief is ultimately disqualifies them from having a decision-making role in our spaces, because that belief creates paradigms that exclude entire populations of people. Let's see, Freed wrote, what are your thoughts about the executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping? The email from ILNet stated the executive order establishes requirements at promoting unity in the federal workplace by prohibiting communications in workplace trainings that imply an individual by virtue of their race or sex is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. So my thoughts are this: 10 days ago, a candidate won the race for the election for president, and that candidate has made it clear that they are going to reverse that executive order. That's my thought with regards to that particular executive order. And then, the person that had posed the first question that I talked about, they talked about leaving in the face of all the racial messages, please bombard them. The thing is this conversation, there are a lot of stakeholders in IL that don't want this conversation to be had. And I understand, this is scary stuff. The idea of scooching over and making room for other people, immediately it's very human to think, well, what am I going to lose out on? I've become very accustomed to things operating the way that they are. That has offered me lots of benefits. And the idea of having to share is very scary to me. I get that. But nevertheless, this is work that needs to be done. We need to be inclusive of everybody, period. This is not a should we do this kind of thing ultimately. This is something that must be done. Again, if we don't commit to making sure that our spaces are truly inclusive of everybody, we are ultimately a movement that is hypocritical, unfortunately. And so I want to, before I open up for folks to ask questions verbally, I want to talk about racism explicitly here real quick before we wrap this up. All right. We've been talking about around racism. So let's actually define it. But before we do, I actually want to talk about racism because I want to talk about diversity and intersectionality even more. So, because we talk about diversity in IL a lot. Oh, we need more diversity in IL. We need more diversity. And typically when we use the word diversity, it's in the context of there's an absence of racially marginalized people in this space. We need more racially marginalized people in this space. And, diversity, the word, there's more to it than we need more Black people in this space. Diversity really runs the gamut. It's inclusive of differences in a variety of experiences, racial experience, certainly, socioeconomic differences, religious beliefs, political proclivities, sexual orientations, gender identities, disability status, et cetera, et cetera. It's very superficial. Like, these are my differences. Those are their differences, et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't get to, it's kind of the pinnacle of the iceberg. But, in order to really have conversation about why there's a disparity of racial representation in our spaces, we need to look at what's happening beneath the surface, so to speak, where the iceberg is invariably much larger than it appears to be at the top. That's where conversations about intersectionality happen. So intersectionality is all about the interconnected nature, social categorizations. So race, class, gender, disability status, et cetera, sexual orientation in an individual or in a group. And when we're looking at something intersectionally, we're acknowledging that there are layers of oppression that happen when a person is a member of more than one marginalized community. Or when we're looking at systems intersectionally, that means that we are keeping in mind that we are potentially creating space for people that are multiply marginalized, and that we need to take that into consideration. Now, historically, with regards to the disability community, we've strictly looked at disability. And then we started looking at disability and gender. And then we started looking at disability and gender, and to a certain extent, a person's status as far as sexual orientation. But when the conversation about, well, let's add race and ethnicity to the mix, that's when things got kind of squirrely. And it was like, well, I don't see color, or I don't see that. And so that has kind of put the kibosh on our movement being truly intersectional. And the deeper conversation that needs to be had is, how does that negatively impact services that we provide to consumers? If we're refusing to see their color, how are we customizing services? How are we seeing the whole person? We don't have time to dive into that right now, unfortunately. That's more part 2 type stuff. But we, in order to become an intersectional movement, we need to be cognizant with regards to how these layers of oppression or marginalization overlap and impact each other. And so diversity can be attained without addressing how systems multiply marginalize people. And so your goal can be diversity and you bring in 6 diverse faces into a space, but you've done absolutely nothing to address what's going on systemically that prohibited them from thriving in that space in the first place. And so you have unintentionally, unwittingly placed racially marginalized people in a situation where they're going to become harmed because the space was never built to hold, to accommodate them in the first place. And it's never been retrofitted to accommodate them. This is why it's very important for us to look at things less from a diversity standpoint and more from an intersectional standpoint, because in order to look at a space intersectionally or a system, we do need to address what's going on that was creating barriers to the inclusion of racially marginalized folks in the first place. And so I see that we are running really super low on time. And so I'm going to skip a few slides. This will be my last slide for you all today. And it's about racism. We do a lot of hair splitting with regards to, well, what is racism? And arguing regarding the semantics of, well, what's the perfect definition of racism? But the fact of the matter is that we need to do less of that and more focus on how does racism manifest? Because the fact of the matter is that racism is the normal setting of our society. It's the status quo. It's the way that we've always done things, no matter what color our skin is. We've all been operating in this society with an understanding of what the default setting is. There's that word again. And that default setting has perpetuated the benefit of one group of folks at the expense of other groups of folks. And the reason why we haven't really been able to engage in meaningful conversations about this is because the system provides enough benefit to white people, no matter where you are on the socioeconomic scale, that there's been little incentive to talk about it. Why would I want to talk deeply about a system that's giving me perks and possibly risk my access to those perks? Ultimately, as far as DNA is concerned, we're more genetically identical than we are different. But it's our society, it's the powers that be that have created these arbitrary hoops that we jump through. And if you successfully scale the hoop because you have white skin, then you win. You get these benefits. And if you don't, then you lose and you don't get the benefits. And, the goalposts, to mix metaphors, have been moved around and shifted throughout the existence of the United States in the interest of perpetuating the status quo and maintaining that default setting. And again, to come back to the point that I came to at the beginning, if you are white, you have been conditioned to not notice a thing about any of this stuff. And perhaps you've had moments of clarity and you've temporarily been cognizant of this stuff, and it's been deeply uncomfortable. And so you put it away and you just keep going. But by and large, you've been conditioned to not notice this stuff. If you're racially marginalized out of necessity, you've been conditioned to be acutely aware of this stuff. Racially marginalized people, Black folks in particular, and brown folks, practically have PhDs in this stuff because our survival depends on us being able to navigate these spaces that, one, weren't built for us, and two, were built in the context of us remaining subordinate to them. And so our time has drawn to a close, unfortunately. And so I will stop the screen share and see if we have any further questions or comments in the chat. Ingracia wrote, here in California, we have the Crown Act for our hair, and that's wonderful. We're seeing legislation happening on a state-by-state basis that protects people who have natural hair. And allows for us to not be discriminated against because of the texture of our hair. But think about that. It's nearly 2021, right? We're well into the 21st century. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I thought that we'd be, having flying cars by now. And we're having to advocate on a state-by-state basis for people to be able to wear their hair as it naturally grows out of their head and not be fired as a result of that. And so that's something to think about. But ultimately, what I hope you take away from this, our time together, this 2-hour session, is a beginning understanding of the fact that, as is the case with mainstream society, there's a default setting. The further removed you are from that default setting, the more marginalized you are, the more on the fringes of society. Our parallel society, independent living, also has a default setting. A lot of the people whose voices we need to hear from are so on the fringes of our parallel society that we can't reach them. And in order to reach them, we have to continue this conversation. We cannot stop this conversation because we're uncomfortable, because there are a large number of folks at the fringes that would benefit from participating in the 5 core services of our ILCs, at the very least. But also, again, a disproportionate number of those folks end up incarcerated, institutionalized, or whatever. So if we're talking about free our people all the time, those are our people too. And we're not aware that they exist out there. And so, let 2020 be the year where we come to terms with the fact that our people are out there and we need to be freeing them as well. And so I want to thank you all for your time. And I will hand it back to either Russell or Megan. And again, Russell has the PowerPoint, and I will throw my email address into the chat if you want to reach out to me personally. So I will stop talking now. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Rema, and it was a real pleasure having you here with us today to create this space and this dialogue. And I personally, for one, am very much looking forward to continuing this conversation and making sure that we are taking the necessary steps to promote having the discussion and deeply understanding what it is about our network that supports the institutional bias and racism. So thank you very much. I will remind all of you that we have a break now for lunch. And in 30 minutes, we have our next session, the Building Power Through Messaging presentation, which will be led by Cameron Moore, our Communications and Marketing Director here at CFILC. I hope that you all enjoy your lunch, take care of yourselves, and I encourage all of you to continue these conversations as we move throughout not just the next couple days in the summit, but back in your workplaces and even in your communities. Thank you very much.